Yeah, so our next speaker is Laura Hayden. She is got involved with QLaw actually in the last round of second parent adoption clinics that we did in 2018 and did a really fantastic job, and is going to talk a little bit about the role of social workers in this process, which is not something that attorneys get trained on very often. So listen up and listen carefully, because I think it's really valuable information. Thanks.
Okay, and I do think in order to help everyone get their CLEs, I think Cynthia will be giving a little bit of a brief introduction to the social work role before I get started, yeah?
My bad.
No worries. So if you want to come up and join me, and then when you're done talking, I'll start talking.
So there were a few things during my presentation that I skipped over because I knew I'd have this opportunity to talk about them. First of all, I think that the attorney part of adoptions is actually a very small part of the adoption process. And from my perspective, the social workers actually do a lot more work and deal with more sensitive situations because they are actually visiting people, asking them very personal questions, and I think it's it is something that the attorney does as well, but the social workers will often go to these people's homes, and that is, creates a whole different kind of scenario that has different considerations, which I know Laura will talk about. And Laura did a great job of actually redoing all of the social worker forms to make them more inclusive and a little bit, I guess, more palatable to people that have to go through this process. There are a lot of different things that the social workers need to collect because they are required to do so via statute. I am actually not sure, with the judges sometimes how concerned they are about every box being checked, but the social workers have a responsibility to do what's required by statute. So they have to get those health forms, medical certificates, financial forms, all of that. And like I said, as part of the process, when we're submitting the working papers and forms go to adoption services will sometimes come back and say that certain things are missing from the social worker report, and then we have to tell the social worker we need this or that thing, and so they will then do that, and we will submit it to the court. The only problems that I've had in the past is the commissioners in ex parte have been a little bit picky sometimes about what's included in the social worker report. Again, I think this is because of a lack of understanding about what these adoptions are, but I have actually had a commissioner reject a social worker report because it was done in an office and not at the home of the parties. This was a social worker that has probably done hundreds of reports in her office, and then all of a sudden they decided that that was not okay. Well, in my mind, I'm like, well, if it's not required by statute, which I didn't see that it had to be at the home, a description of the home, would be required. Why not let people sort of not have that invasiveness? But the commissioners and the adoption committee sort of felt that home visits were important still. So that was something that has come up before. I don't know that that would necessarily be the case, but with a special set, but that's a thing. I've also had commissioners come back and tell me that they wanted more information in the social worker report addressing the child's relationship with religion. I've also had commissioners, one commissioner in particular, want to know that the child's preferences are being respected, and also that the parents weren't withholding food as punishment for the children, and they would want the social worker to specifically address those things in the report. There's nothing in that particular case that suggested this was an issue, but there are some things that can come up with the judges and commissioners regarding what they want to see in these reports. And it is sort of interesting in these situations where we are essentially doing confirmatory adoptions where, in my opinion, the social worker report shouldn't be required. Well, I still am so glad that there are social workers that are willing to do these and to do them well in a way that is going to make them as smooth as possible for the clients, to make the process that is awkward slightly less awkward. So I'm going to turn it over to Laura, and then you can take it from here.
Sounds good. Want to turn off that? Aha. Okay, and Denise, I did not, let me just go ahead and grab my phone so I can time keep myself as well. Okay, thanks so much for having me. To be totally honest, I could talk to you forever about this because I get excited about all of social work and home reports, but my goal is that I will talk a little bit and then we will talk together a lot. However, let me give you a really brief introduction. So my name is Laura Hayden. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a licensed clinical social worker, and I've been practicing in the Seattle area for the last 10 years. I've worked with all sorts of populations, but particularly a lot of work with kids, teens, families, and particularly with LGBTQ teens and families. So this is not my day job. My day job, in fact, is working with trans youth and families all day long. This is something that I do for, we usually say for fun and profit, but there's really no profit. So this is something I do for fun. My goal is to help other people better understand how to do it so that there are more of us who can do these reports. So before I start talking, a couple shows of hands I'll ask for. Who here is a social worker? Me and Kian, keeping it real. For our future audience, this is why we need you. There just aren't that many of us. For everyone else, everyone gets to participate in this part. What are some things that you want to know by the end of the hour? What's some stuff you want to know about social workers in second parent adoption? It's not a rhetorical question. You should put up your hand. Yeah.
What are deal breakers?
Great question. I'm going to read them all at the end. Okay, what else? Okay, what else we got?
What do you say to the families
And what else do you want to know? What was that last piece about?
Am I allowed to do it with another social worker?
What else? Great. And anything else? Okay, so I'll read you the list. What are deal breakers in families? What would make us pause in the process? What qualifications do social workers need in order to do home studies? How do we help make families feel more comfortable? How do we navigate liability insurance for social workers? Can we bring a second social worker? And what should attorneys tell social workers? These are great questions. I'm hoping I'll answer a lot of them in my slides, but we'll also come back at the end just in case. In case I wasn't ill-prepared enough. Gonna bring water over here too. Okay, so you've gotten your brief introduction from Cynthia. We love to talk about social work roles because social workers are all designed to wear many, many hats for the pay of one hat. So just to talk a little bit about the social work roles here, a couple different things that you're being asked to do. One of them is to be the reporter. So the court needs you to actually complete a home study report, And that information will become part of the record so that the adoption can be finalized. So you are reporting the facts in this case. Being the facilitator. So families really need help understanding what is the home study process. Often attorneys need help figuring out what is the home study process and what will happen before and after. The more information people have, the more comfortable they tend to be. Being an advocate. So we have a lot of families. By nature, most of the families who are in need of a second parent adoption are vulnerable to systems in one way or more, right? So families who are vulnerable to systems because of race, income, sexual orientation, gender, and other identities might need extra support in this process, might need reassurance, may need advocacy around things that they're frightened of in this process. And this also is an opportunity to be a resource broker, which is at least one of my favorite things, if not every social worker. So you really can use the home study as an opportunity, not just to complete the legal bare minimum, but also to help families find resources for family, medical, mental health, legal resources, things that will make their life easier as queer and trans families. So breaking it down, I feel like this is a process that can feel really overwhelming. Let me just tell you how I follow these steps. Yes, you are right. That is New Kids on the Block and step by step. As someone who works with teenagers, I've realized that all of my references are dated, so I've just embraced it. So, first thing that I like to do with any family that gets connected with me is a discussion of the process and fees. So often, literally all they've heard from their attorney is, you need a home study. Contact a social worker. End of story. And so they're like, I don't know what that means, but it sounds horrible. So I will usually walk them through start to finish exactly what's going to happen. And I have many checklists and other things in the presentation. So if you don't feel prepared by the end of this to tell them start to finish, let me know because I haven't done my job. But we'll go through the whole process and talk about fees. I will talk about fees a little bit more in the kind of hot tips section we have, but I think knowing your fees in advance is important. A lot of social workers are not used to setting a fee scale, especially if you work in an agency or otherwise not in private practice, and so people will honestly be like, oh, I don't know what you need to pay me, which is not a great starting point for negotiation. Doesn't make anyone feel good. So think about this before you talk to families. I know Cynthia talked about the court order authorizing the post-placement report, so that's a really important piece of the process. The pre-visit paperwork. We're actually, in my process, the goal is to actually get as much information as you can from the family before you've even visited them. I found that a lot of people are more comfortable having this information, having the opportunity to sit down and write it in a way that feels comfortable for them versus having you, a stranger in their home, battering them with questions. So there's paperwork that they do beforehand. That way there are no surprises at the home visit. You already have all the information. Doing the home visit itself. This is a very necessary part of the process for families who ask, are you sure you need to meet us? Yes. Are you sure you need to come to our home? Pretty much yes. Preparing the report itself, pretty straightforward. We then submit the report. It goes to the Adoption Services Committee, and then there's the eventual finalization. So hopefully this helps you visualize what the process looks like with social workers from the very start to the very finish. And again, we'll go into great detail. So we refer a lot to paperwork, and I will go through each individual piece of paperwork that's all included in your packet at the end. But there are some pieces that are required and a couple optional ones that I throw in. So this maybe kind of speaks to the question of how do we help families feel most comfortable. With families and social workers, I feel like a lot of people see the forms and are like, what do I do with this? So I do have a little instructions checklist. That's the first thing in the packet after your PowerPoint. That is for you, not for families. So this is for the social worker that just helps keep you on track with like, what forms am I sending the family? What forms am I sending to the attorney? Again, it's not required by the court. You don't send it to anyone. You use it for yourself. I also have something called Telling Your Family Story, which I created as just kind of a strengths-based prompt for the family. I don't know if you've ever asked anyone, tell me about yourself, and they immediately forget anything they know about themselves. That is like times 10 for this process that feels very vulnerable. So with this, I really have given specific prompts to family about what sort of information I'm hoping they'll give me in advance that will help me with the report. Again, we'll get to that. And the goal is really to make it strengths-based. We acknowledge that this is not a fun process, but can we make it a better process? things that are very much required. You'll see in there the second parent adoption questionnaire. So each parent has to fill out their own. So birth parent, adoptive parent, if you have additional adoptive parents, every person needs their own copy. The financial statement of applicants, you only need one for the family. Again, speaking of second parent adoption. The adoptive parent medical report, so signed by the doctor of the adoptive parent. The adoptive child medical report, signed by the child's doctor. The background check, there are two potential ways to accomplish this, and I will tell you more about them a little bit later. There's the watch report, which is, oh man, Washington, gosh, I wish I could tell you that whole acronym, but essentially it's criminal background history in Washington. And then there's the DCYF CAN report through Department of Children, Youth, and Families, and that's specific to child abuse and neglect reporting. And then there's the home study report narrative. So that is the actual report that we give to the court. Those are the required pieces, as well as the top two that I've said, you know, optional, can make the process easier. Best practice tips before we get into this. Things to think about before you say, yes, I will do your home study, would be think about how you'll handle dual relationships. So we talk about this a lot in social work, is every social worker has an ethical responsibility to avoid dual relationships. So being someone's social worker versus being their neighbor, being their sister-in-law, being, you know, all these other things that you can be. Of course, like everything in ethics, it's not that simple. So second parent adoption is very tricky because, like Cynthia mentioned, these are confirmatory adoptions. This is very different than if I was working at Department of Children, Youth, and Families deciding where to place a foster child, right? I would be the person determining the placement for a child. In this case, this is a child who already lives with this parent. So we are, in fact, just helping kind of people secure their civil rights. So it's a really different process, but there's still some trickiness. Also, the queer and trans small world factor, if any of you are members and move in the same community, it's smaller than any of us would like most of the time. The more factors you add in there culturally, the smaller it gets, right? So when people say, I want a social worker who's queer, trans, poly, kink, competent, and also speaks Spanish, you're like, okay, there's one person and you've already dated them. So this is where stuff gets tricky, right? But you really have to think. So again, it's not saying that there's generally a hard and fast rule of like, you've met this person, you may never speak to them again, you may never do their home report, but of really thinking, okay, how would I answer for this if in the course of finalizing their adoption, this were to come up? If someone were to say, oh, have you had a previous relationship? Has the social worker had a previous relationship with this family? What would I say and how would I explain that? I will say personally, you know, I have had definitely known people who have said, you know, for cultural reasons, again, our family is looking for someone very, very specific. And my wife has said she just will not do it. Like, we are a very private family. And she has said, like, she just doesn't feel comfortable having anyone in the home that doesn't meet these criteria. That left 2 social workers. Only one of them knows how to do second parent adoptions. So do you do it? An important thing to discuss with the family and sometimes to give a heads up to the attorney depending on how relevant you think it'll be. But just think early. Checking your liability coverage. So Keaton's question here. So again, if you work at an agency right now, you have a full-time job and your organization pays your liability insurance, it will not cover this work. Unless you are doing this as a part of your 40-hour-per-week job, which I suspect you will not be, you will need to get separate liability coverage. If you're someone like a private practice therapist, you may already have individual liability coverage, but I would say go back and check and see if there are limitations. So for example, sometimes there's a difference between practice coverage and facilities coverage, where if someone is going to be coming to your facility and they trip on your sidewalk, insurance might protect you differently than if someone sues you for malpractice. So I would say call your liability provider and say, hey, I'm doing this. Does this make a difference? If you are someone who doesn't currently have your own individual liability insurance, just rest assured, even if you are not an NASW member, Spoiler alert, almost no one is an NASW member. You can still get very inexpensive insurance. I think I pay like $50 a year for insurance to do all of the stuff I do outside of work. Setting a fee scale. So this is, again, for some people, kind of a big ethical question of how much money should we, can we, are we accepting for this work? I particularly found this challenging because when I learned how to do second parent adoptions, I could literally only locate 2 people who were doing them, who were social workers who were willing to talk to me. And so I just asked both of them, what do you charge? And then I said, okay, what if I charged half of that as my full rate and a quarter of that as my sliding scale? So I know no one ever wants to talk about money specifics ever because we live in a capitalist hellscape. However, I'll just tell you, the person who I trained with to learn how to do second parent adoptions charges $800. So I charge $400 as my full rate and $200 as my lower sliding scale. There are obviously projects I volunteered last year with QLaw when we did not have funds to pay anyone. So those I did for $0. But really be clear about where you're volunteering your time. You know, obviously I would probably charge a different amount if this was my full-time job. So just be conscious of what you're doing and how you want to set that. Connecting with the attorney proactively. So depending on how many adoptions they've done in the past, they may or may not reach out to you to get your CV. If a lot of people say, do I need a special different CV? I just made one that kind of highlights my family experience and kind of all my child, youth, family stuff. That's what I use. Haven't had any problems. And if a family contacts me and I haven't heard from their attorney yet, I just ask for the attorney's contact information and send it over. Scheduling the home visit and giving paperwork to family well in advance. So Cynthia mentioned this process can take quite a while. Really, for me, the actual process of doing the home visit and preparing the report does not take as much. That doesn't take me months, but it's the scheduling with the family that can be a little bit tricky. So I think basically as soon as someone contacts me, I start saying, great, let's start looking out in the next 1 to 2 months. Let's talk about a date, get something on the calendar, especially if people have multiple small children, scheduling can be hard. I do try and get paperwork out to them as soon as possible, even though the paperwork is not hard, it is emotionally tough. And also just no one likes paperwork. So people will often put it off as long as possible. I try and allow for that. So I give people paperwork when they first contact me. And usually the visit is 1 to 2 months out. So I send the paperwork out 1 to 2 months out. And I say, please get this to me at least 1 week before your home study. And if I don't have it 1 week before their home study, I email them and say, please give me your paperwork. What you don't want is to get it the day of the home study and find a bunch of surprises that you may or may not feel super prepared to deal with. So you want to give yourself more time. I think acknowledging what I call the unique challenges of the process, which is a social work euphemism, is really important. Like we were talking about earlier with judges, sometimes when you're like, this is celebratory, it's great, and families are like, no, this sucks. That does not exactly inspire a lot of faith, right? That you understand what's going on and that you have empathy for the process. So I think really saying yep, I wish we didn't have to be doing this. This sucks, but I'm glad we're doing it. Let's make it as painless as possible has been a really helpful approach for me. Like I mentioned, getting the paperwork 1 week before the home study. There's a lot of things that are considered optional that I do anyway, just because I don't want the Adoption Services Committee to have to come back and ask for more information. I don't want to slow down the process later. So some people say you don't have to collect a copy of the family's last year's tax returns along with the financial statement. I do anyway, because we don't want it to come up the week before the hearing and slow things down. Again, with the watch versus the DCYF, basically, I'll talk about it here in just a minute, but one of them is much easier and one of them is much more relevant. I have really found that most attorneys don't seem to have a strong requirement between the two, but think in your family situation, is this something where you are concerned that something might come up? Something I do is I actually pre-fill the report before the visit. So with all that information that I gather from families beforehand, I actually go through and pre-fill my narrative report with that information so then I can highlight what's missing. What do I actually need to ask when I go to their house? Usually it's not that much by that point, but you don't want to then be writing it a week later and thinking like, ooh, gotta call them back and ask more questions, because families really want to be done. And asking the attorney to send you a copy of the finalization once it's done, or the family, it doesn't need to be an original because that's crazy, just a scanned copy, but that can help you kind of close your file. You know it's done. So those are some pro tips. One other thing that I think is really important and perhaps particularly social worky, so the rest of you will have to forgive us here, but you're going and doing something super invasive and weird. You're literally going to someone's house and being like, I'm just here to assess your fitness as a parent. Don't worry, be relaxed, act natural. So this is the same thing, honestly, this is the same thing I do in other stressful situations, is before I go in and start asking questions at someone's house, not only do I acknowledge this in my initial conversation with the family, which is usually over email or the phone or text, but I also, when I go to their house, before we get started, say, hey, I know this is really weird. I'm in your house and I'm going to ask you like weird personal questions. Before we start, what do you want to ask me? What do you want to know about how I got involved with this, how I learned how to do this? Really, like anything you want to know. I will say that I am probably less private than many people, but I've never had a family ask me a question that's real inappropriate. What they generally want to know is like, do you have some empathy for this process? And often they'll be like, do you have kids? Are you married? Do you have to do this? Have you ever had a second parent adoption? Why do you do this? And what they want to know is like, because I care. Like, you're not in it for the money, you're in it because you want other families in your community to have the protections they need. But I found that families have really appreciated that and been like, oh, okay. Just kind of helps equalize the power balance just a little bit. So that's how I open all home visits. So as professionals, this is what we think when we think of the home visit. We're like, there's going to be children and coffee and we'll just sit and chat and it will be so pleasant. And then what families are imagining is like that we're coming to interrogate them. Yeah. So I think really important to know, like, while I'm really excited about this home visit, they're probably actually not very excited about this home visit. They're probably just very excited to get it done. So being aware of those expectations can be really helpful. The unique challenges of the process, right? So I think this is an important thing to talk about really even before we get into the forms and the details. I would say at best, people find this process like kind of annoying. At worst, I know families who are like, I found that really incredibly traumatic. And other families who literally are like, I feel ashamed that we have waited. Like, I know people that have, kids who are 10 and are like, we keep putting it off and we keep waiting because it just sounds so scary and awful and expensive and we just can't do it. So for some people, just totally out of reach. I think good to acknowledge the history of legal and child welfare systems involvement for vulnerable families. It's not a happy one, right? And I think especially for a lot of us, like for me, like I'm white. My family has we're middle class, right? Solidly so, and have professional degrees. And so we are a lot less likely to have bad, scary government things happen to us in a lot of ways, but that's there are still tons of families out there, right? Like we can all talk about case law of people whose parental rights should have held up but didn't, people whose children were removed when they shouldn't have been, and our families that we're working with, they remember this stuff. This has happened in their communities too. So being like, oh, this is just annoying can sometimes be a little bit of an understatement. Every time you have kind of an additional vulnerability, that makes this harder, right? So for families that are financially unstable, disabled, families that aren't white, maybe are not citizens or have not been citizens in the past, justice system involvement, family structure, all that sort of thing. That's going to make it scarier all the time. So to be like, well, other families just, found this was annoying, but they just sucked it up. So why is it so hard for you? Not super helpful, right? Let's try and understand why families might feel the way they do. And I think for me, a really helpful thing in starting to do this is before I did my first home study, I asked all the families I know who'd had home studies how it went for them. And I know people that had had them as recently as last month or 15 years ago. And I had people tell me, some things that were really reassuring. And some people were like, oh, well, it's this random dude that asked us about our sex life. That felt pretty inappropriate, but guess it was part of the process. Or, you know, a family that had like 2 butch moms and they had a friend staying with them who happened to be super femme, and they were like, see some red high heels by the door. Whose are those? First thing the person said when they walked in. And they were like, okay, this automatically became horrible. Good to know. So just like even like small things from people that didn't have bad intentions have really soured this process for a lot of people. So my goal is like, I would like to not do that for our families. Things that we want to offer would be, we want to be realistic, we want to offer reassurance, and we want to advocate. So being honest about how the process works, and that these are the parts of it that are required, whether they should be or not. This is about how long it will take and how much it might cost, so that families know what to expect, and that, yeah, we wish it wasn't like this, and here are the things that might make it different in the future, even though this is what we've got right now. Reassuring them that the goal here is not actually to criticize their parenting, take away their child, do any of the scary, scary things, but the goal is to secure family rights as painlessly as possible. In individual cases, I think advocating for strengths-based views of issues like mental health, disability, criminal history is something that is really well within our role. I had a friend who put this off because they had had a cancer diagnosis in the past, and even though they're in remission now, said, is that going to be a factor? Is there a chance they'll say, no, I can't adopt my kids? So being able to say, here, you want to look at the report and see, here's what I wrote about your family's experience with cancer and how it's actually, you know, been a strengthening factor for your family. Systemically, as social workers, also being able to advocate for fewer barriers in this process, right? So when you're the person doing the report, sometimes you get the chance to advocate for how these reports should go. So those are all different things that we can do. I'm going to get into the forms here, but before I do that, are there other questions that have come up since I first asked? Anything else you're wanting to know?
Maybe you alluded that you might get into this, so I don't want to, if you are, just let me know. But how do you deal with folks who do have a CPS history, like up to and including like findings?
Great question. So we'll definitely chat about that when we talk about deal breakers. Let me walk you through the forms. I thought they might be in my PowerPoint, but they're not. So if you can turn to, let's see, after page 4 of my presentation, you'll actually see the forms. So let me walk through and see what questions people have. So on that first page, we just have the instructions and checklist. Again, this is not to be submitted to the court, to the attorney. This is literally just for social workers to use. So first piece of making sure you reach out to the attorney to offer a copy of your CV, and then which forms you want to send the families. Just to chat a little bit about the difference between the watch report and the DCYF CAN report. The watch report is really basic criminal history. You don't need someone's permission to run it. Interestingly enough, you literally just need first and last name, date of birth, and $12. And it returns an automatic result. So within 5 minutes, you can run a watch report. And it will tell you, do they have any criminal history that's showing up in Washington State? The CAN report, this is something that you have to type it, get the parent to sign it, the adoptive parent, you sign it, and then you send it to DCYF, and then they return it to you. And in my experience, sometimes it takes them a week to return it, sometimes it takes 2 weeks. They really have no timeline. So that one is much harder to get. So I think I've only ever had one attorney ask me to do the CAN report versus the watch. Everyone else has said that the watch works fine. Things to consider might be if the family is new to Washington State, a Washington State background check may not be as useful than someone who's lived in Washington their whole life. Or again, if you know that there's potential CPS findings and you want to submit what that actually is, then the CAN report is going to be really helpful. So scheduling your home study, getting forms signed, and then writing the report. So in here, it really is just a checklist of all of these forms. So any other questions about the checklist? Okay, let's walk through the telling your family story piece. So again, this is just something that I use personally. If anyone wants to use it, they're welcome to do it. You might want to take my contact information off of it because otherwise I'll get your patient's stories and you don't want that. But the goal here is strengths-based. So again, I think people are really thinking like, you're interrogating me, you just want to know what's wrong, what do I do? And so we really say like, this is a chance to brag, like your spouse or your partner or your kids are probably your favorite people. So like, this is your chance to brag on them. Like, tell us about your family, tell us what's rad. We also include, tell us the things that are hard, which are really tough to get out of people. This is why we ask specific questions. So even just how you met, right? Tell us your how you met story. Who doesn't like telling that story? Unless you have a not safe for work how you met story, in which case I say, if they seem hesitant, I'm like, it's okay. What did you tell your grandmother about how you met? Let's use that. Doesn't have to be detailed. But you know, have they moved together? Has someone been deployed? Have they been long distance? All those things. We talk a lot about strengths and challenges. I always emphasize to families, people will almost never tell you any challenges unless you drag it out of them because they're like, why would I tell you something bad about my family? You're writing a report about us. But if you don't tell people what the challenges are, then they start to wonder like, well, what aren't you telling us? Which is why we say, here, let's present that positively. So, you know, if your family has dealt with chronic illness early on, let's talk about what a challenge that was and how great it's made you at, you know, being a support network, making decisions as a team. Describing your child. What are your family values? Which can open up conversations to things like religion, if you're a religious family. And we talk about resources you use. This is a really important part. I will say you'll find in the questionnaire there's a pretty significant bias against mental health counseling and family counseling. Those are considered as like, if you've answered yes that you've accessed that, you have to say specifically why. You have to justify your use of those services, which as a social worker hurts my heart, right? That we're like discouraging people from counseling. So here we say, what resources do you use to support your family's health and happiness? How about couples counseling? How about family counseling? How about support groups, community groups? Tell us about your therapy. We promise it's okay, is what we're saying here. And then specifically asking, are there resources you want to know more about? We have a lot of families that say, we don't know any other queer parents, we're new to town, or say, you know, we're really struggling with, like, how do you keep your identity as a stay-at-home parent? And there's really great resources out there. So we actually do want to give families things that are helpful, which is how we use that. And then here is the narrative. You can literally just use this. I don't know if we're also sending these out, or I think we have already sent this whole presentation out electronically. So please use this as a Google Doc. It's available for everyone. You can literally just put it in here. It has pretty much everything that's needed in terms of strengths, challenges, children, what do their rooms look like, whatever you need. Home, childcare schedules, etc. And then in here, you'll see the second parent adoption questionnaire. As Cynthia mentioned, the versions that we got of these when I learned how to do this were like 1980s, like DSHS photocopies. So they literally all said like mother, father, like husband, wife. So we've changed all of that. Things I was told we can't change are, you know, we have to ask, do you have any health problems? Have you ever had a major injury? Have you ever consulted a counselor? Have you ever had marital problems? Yeah.
Okay, so I have a question about any
previous. Yes. Anything that could, because otherwise, let's say they have a criminal history under a previous name or a DCYF, and that comes up, then it'll be as if they were trying to hide it. So things we really frame as, this is just like you would report if you had a maiden name. This is not just for trans folks changing their names. Everyone that's ever had any other name has to report it. They ask here again about family court services. So this is a place for parents to be honest. Financial statements, this is actually not as bad as I thought it was going to be with financial statements. It doesn't ask you to like justify your debt or anything else weird, but it does ask a lot of questions I've found parents don't know, like life insurance, death benefit, etc. Most people are like, I literally have no idea. So point them to their HR representative at work. If they have those things, that's the person who will know. And then medical record, I have found that doctors really have no problems with those, so we don't tend to have issues with that come up. So those are the required forms. Any questions about required forms before we get back to the questions you asked at the beginning? Okay, again, I have all of these available in Google Docs. If you can't find them or can't access them from what we pulled, just email me. Yeah? So in this case, I will say I've used, because I've had people email me, I've used that as essentially like an in-kind release for all of this. Because usually people will email me. Often what people will do, which helps, is will email me and CC their attorney saying, hey, this is the person, and that's often what I'll ask people to do, just so that the attorney doesn't think I'm just like a rando coming for their client's information, to say, hey, look, we've been introduced, here are the forms I'll be sending you. If you want it to be fancy, you could probably use one. But again, I've never, for the court, no one's like, show us your release of information. Okay, so what qualifications do social workers need to do reports? This is a great question, and I've heard varying things on it, and I've seen varying things. What I have seen is that the basic requirement is to be an MSW, a Master of Social Work, so to have the degree, because that's what's in a lot of the like court appointment forms. I have seen some sample reports from people who had like bachelors in human services, etc. I don't know if they were approved, so I can't say for sure. I think that was someone living in a rural county where they were having a harder time finding someone. You don't, however, need to be licensed, so you do not need to be a licensed independent clinical social worker. That's what I've been told so far. Keep you up to date if that changes.
I just wanted to comment that I've actually seen a case where a social worker that someone had tried to appoint, they were doing a case themselves, was declined, and they had an MSW, and I can't really say why they were declined, but I think that there is something with the court when they're used to seeing certain social workers, like they'll sign off on them with less scrutiny. Oh. So I just wanted to comment that so there was an instance where a social worker was declined that had an MSW. They also had a lot of things on their CV that had to do with being connected to the LGBTQ community, which I thought that was a good thing. But they didn't necessarily have like specific training around doing this particular thing because there's not a lot of training. So I'm not really sure why they were declined, and I do think that there may be some subjectivity going on, and there's not any specific requirements.
Yeah, so there is a clause in there that I've heard about, like, must have, like, relevant family experience or, like, child and family experience, and that's not defined in any way that I'm aware of. That's just what I've seen in writing. So that is why I made a CV that's, like, catered to this. It's like, let's talk about my home visits. Let's talk about my assessment of children and families, because you don't want that to happen. But yeah, I think beyond that, like, it's pretty fuzzy. They could always say, like, no, you can't use this person. I haven't had it happen to me, but we know it does. Let's see. Yeah.
I wonder, I don't know if there's anything that would stop you from resubmitting the motion to a different commissioner. I mean, that could be an option if there's something that happens. And
yeah, if a family feels strongly about working with a certain person, for sure. We already talked about navigating liability insurance. In terms of home safety and visiting, I will say it is kind of like, I don't know if you've ever done work that does home visiting. I used to run a home visiting program in rural Pierce County where there were a lot of guns. And so safety questions were like a very real thing. I think it's up to individual comfort level. I will say most people, the more you skew your ratios, the more nervous it makes people. So if you have one parent or, you know, two parents and three social workers, attorneys, whatever, people are going to get pretty nervous. So that's something to be aware of. I also know people who, if they're like, I haven't done this before, or this person lives in an area that I'm not familiar with, or it just feels a little funny, have been like, let's meet at a coffee shop first just to go over paperwork and fees. Get a feel for it. But I think you always could say, hey, I have someone I'm training, if you felt like you needed to, and then it would be up to the family whether or not they feel comfortable with that, just like any other time we bring an observer.
My worry with that is that I've never done it before, and so I would be worried about being alone as my first. I just don't want to mess it up, right?
Yes. So good news is, I think, yes, it would be totally fine to say, hey, I'm in training. I wanted to bring someone has been training me for shadowing. I think that's totally legitimate use. And I think also, if you miss a question, you can always call or email later to say, I missed something. It's not the end of the world. So don't worry that you're going to blow the visit.
All right, thank you.
In terms of what attorneys should tell social workers, anything you can share, I think, from this process is helpful. Again, I think the more detail we can give, sometimes the less scary it is. But in general, if you can say, the social worker is someone who's on your team. Their goal is to help secure your parental rights. They're going to help get you the information you need. They'll provide all the paperwork. You just have to answer questions honestly. They'll make a visit to your home. The goal is that you get to brag on your cute kids and your house. And I have had people be like, my house is in the middle of construction and our basement is flooded, but we really need to get this done. Are you going to give me points off? And I'm like, there are no points. It's okay. I am not even going to put that in my report because it's really not relevant, right? I'm not describing the condition of your home unless there's a health or safety hazard. So really telling people, they're like, I live with my mom. My partner and I live with my mom, and there's a bunch of screaming kids running around. And I'm like, perfect. I love screaming kids, which I do. But we really are not here to judge how your house works. Our goal is just seeing that you have a healthy, safe home environment. So really trying to offer reassurance on that. So again, just letting them know they'll have to fill out some basic paperwork that we'll provide. It's all stuff they know. It won't be super hard. It might be a little awkward, but not scary. And then it'll be us visiting them at their house, and they can show off their family. And that's about it. I also tell families that they are welcome to read anything I write about them. I don't tend to take a ton of notes in appointments because I usually, again, have my forms pre-filled, which helps that you're not scribbling down every word they say, because that also tends to make people nervous. But I also say, I would be happy to send you my report if you want to read it before I send it to your attorney. You can always ask me if you have any questions. Most families don't take me up on it, but I think just knowing you're in some control of this process. I'm not just saying things about you that you don't get to know. So I think those are things, anything you as an attorney can say to paint we know this is scary, but it's pretty straightforward. It doesn't have to take a long time, and these people are on your team. Again, helping make families more comfortable. I know I've mentioned a couple things of even just in the documentation we send them saying, hey, we know that these are rights that you already have and should have. We just want to help. Acknowledging that it's weird and awkward. Giving them a chance to ask us questions since we're going to ask them a ton of questions. Other things that can help make families more comfortable. Again, in social work, we talk a lot about disclosure. So when is disclosure about yourself helpful or less helpful? And of course, the defining line is always, is this for the benefit of the client or is this for the benefit of myself? So for me, really judging we've had families be I've had families be but what do you know about this process? What do you know about? And so I've been oh, my spouse and I are trying to get gay pregnant right now. And then people are oh my God, what donor are you using? Tell me everything, right? Instant icebreaker. Some people are I would not disclose that about myself because it makes me uncomfortable. All totally personal. But I've had families say okay, you're a part of my same community. That makes me feel better. Or okay, you at least like children, right? This is not a weird Matilda situation. No. So really doing what we can to be open with families, I think, is really helpful. And again, offering as much transparency as possible. These are the forms we use. This is what I'm writing. This is what I'm not writing. I also have families ask me about deal breakers. So let's talk about that because that's a fun topic. So deal breakers. Families want to know, and I've had so many families ask me, and people tell you a bunch of stuff that you actually maybe don't need to know in the service of knowing this. People are like, I got busted with pot when I was 17 and I know it's sealed, but is that going to be a deal breaker? And I'm like, well, there's no way I would have known that unless you told me, but no. Similarly, parents who are disabled or have significant chronic illness history, and what I tell them is, what I often say is, let's think about this as if I were coming to your home in a worst case situation, right? This is a best case situation where I'm here to help, right? I'm here to help in this process that is confirmatory. But even in a worst case situation, let's say someone had a concern and I came to your home. The only way that I could do anything that do anything that might even put a pause on a process for your family is if I had a significant concern about your child's health and safety. So saying like, a parent having a medical history with a disability. Nope, we don't remove children for that, even in a worst case scenario. That alone, not a problem for us. Having a criminal history as a parent, we don't remove straight people's kids for that. We don't say you're not allowed to be on the birth certificate because, and then sometimes if people are like, but really, what if? Then we talk about what is reportable. And unfortunately in Washington state, well, let me phrase this. In Washington state, we are a very parents' rights state when it comes to child and family law, which can be really great, especially for vulnerable families, and can be really challenging for child safety. You really have to do a lot to even get a CPS call in Washington state, much less get any CPS action. There's a really wide range of what we consider to be parent rights to do like what they deem appropriate parenting. So I would be concerned if there were signs of neglect. So if a child was having food withheld as a punishment, that would be concerning. That would be a situation in which any social worker is required to report. If parents were saying, my discipline is that I regularly cane my child. Okay, that is also of concern to us, right? Well, and to be clear, that is not necessarily against the law in Washington state. That's really not necessarily cause for CPS action, unfortunately. But it's noteworthy, right? It's worth investigating. It's worth talking more about. If there was concern, it would have to be like some really, really big concerning stuff. If they said, we don't take our child to the doctor ever, even when they're sick, we would say, okay, are we now talking about neglect? Are you getting the picture of kind of the sort of concerns that would be, and again, I like to call those yellow lights, which I know is frightening, but yellow lights, not red lights. So it's not like if you've ever done any of these bad parenting choices, we automatically yank your children in whatever, no matter what kind of family you're in, parental rights or not. What we do is we stop and we ask more questions. So this is just like anything else. If there's not a significant health or safety concern in your parenting, even if, say, you're really into attachment parenting and I'm really not, I'm not here to judge your parenting choices. I'm just here to confirm that you have a happy, healthy environment. So parenting choices, not here to judge it. Concerns about health and safety, that's where we would ask more questions. So unless we have a significant health or safety concern, at which point what I would do is inform the parent, I know you just mentioned this, and sometimes that can be concerning from a child safety perspective. So here's what we would usually do. And then I would say, we would usually make an informational report to CPS. You can make it with me. We can make the call together just to say, hey, we want to make sure, where does this fall on the side of the line? I can make it, or parents can do with me if people don't necessarily like feeling like they're being talked about. So, and then at that point, we would wait to hear back, is this a concern? I will say in my social work career, probably about 75 to 90% of the informational reports I've made to CPS have not been investigated, much less taken any action on that would limit parenting rights, any choices made in the home. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, much bigger discussion, but it is a true thing. So I would say I have not yet run across a situation in which I have had to make a report in a home study. And so I think it's probably pretty rare. I haven't had anyone with a CPS history yet, so let's move from talking about current health and safety concerns to past health and safety concerns. So if someone has a past CPS history, again, the context I think would be really important. And this is like anything else, just like if we were talking about someone's mental health or criminal history or anything, what we would want to know is contextually what happened and why. So there's a really big difference, right, between intentional child cruelty and neglect that was accidental due to lack of resources in a single incident, right? So we'd want to establish context. And then we would say, okay, what were the CPS recommendations? If there was a finding, what was the recommendation? And then did they follow the recommendation? If they followed the recommendations, then just like with straight folks, there's no restrictions on your future parenting. If you didn't follow the recommendations and things were a terrible downward spiral, that's where we would have more questions. Again, we ask people to disclose. This is one of the great parts about getting the paperwork in advance. You get to see if someone has checked, yes, I have criminal history, yes, I have CPS background, yes, so then you can say, let's talk more about this before we come do your home study. So you can gather more information if you need to talk to their attorney or do a little bit more digging, you might say, hey, I need more information, let's reschedule. Let's push this out a week or two just to make sure we've got the full picture. So this is why it's good to not just ask all those questions in person. No, home studies are not done by Moms Group and Facebook. We will not shame you for your breastfeeding or not breastfeeding or anything like that. Again, really here to talk about health and safety. I am just about out of time. Any last questions about the social work portion? Okay, feel free to be in touch anytime if things pop up.
Great. Thank you, Laura. So one thing I will say, since most of the room is attorneys, is that folks are going to be worried about the answers to those questions before they ever get a chance to talk to the social worker. So it's important when you're talking with families about different choices for parentage orders versus adoptions, that if they have something in their history that presents a really serious concern, you can talk through with them, like, okay, so here's actually what the social workers are looking for. Here's actually what the court cares about. Always, if you run into a situation where you're like, gosh, I actually don't know if this is going to be an issue or not, reach out and ask for help from one of the family law attorney mentor folks, or you can always ask me. And then also in worst case scenarios, you'll notice that in the parentage order conversations this morning, there wasn't any conversation about social workers, and that's because the only context in which a social worker placement report is required is adoption. So if families have something really serious that we think would present a deal breaker to the court, we can always go with a different form of parentage order that can provide protection to the family short of an adoption decree. So we are going to be dealing with, in the Family Matters Clinic, we are specifically reaching out to multiply marginalized families. So, which is like a very antiseptic way of saying, like, poor folks, folks with histories, folks with, weird family arrangements, folks with unusual gender histories, and all of that stuff is completely okay. And we want those people to protect their relationships with their kids because they're already parenting those kids, right? And we don't want their kids' lives to be upended because of a legal wrinkle. So all of that is to say thank you for the social worker perspective, because it's really crucial. And I think as attorneys, we don't always spend enough time talking about social work. Okay, so now I'm going to stop talking because it is lunchtime.